A black woman followed every rule, delivered every result, and still walked through polished hallways lined with quiet sabotage. Her work was stolen, her voice rewritten, and her dignity cornered behind glass walls. But when silence threatened to bury the truth, the CEO Big Shaq walked in, not with questions, but consequences. What followed wasn't just justice, it was a corporate cleansing, and the reckoning made headlines. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Downtown Atlanta shimmered beneath the spring sun, its skyline stacked like a showroom of ambition. The steel and glass of Bright Edge Capital's headquarters glinted like it belonged in another reality. Sleek, pristine, unreachable. Inside, the air conditioning hummed in a constant low drone, like a quiet warning no one acknowledged. The 27th floor sat high above the noise of the street, an architectural testament to wealth and control, and through its automatic glass doors stepped Ava McCullen, heels clicking a rhythm only she truly heard. She was flawless by every metric that had ever been forced upon her. Her blazer tailored, her edges sharp, her resume immaculate. Every line on her CV had been earned, not inherited. And yet, as she moved across the polished floor past a dozen colleagues, who greeted her with professional smiles, something gnawed just beneath the surface. The greetings were practiced, the eye contact brief, the smiles hollow. Ava's office sat in the northeast corner, a room made of more glass than walls. To the outsider, it was a victory. To Ava, it had become a cage of exposure. The transparency wasn't for design, it was surveillance, an ever-present reminder that she was being watched, evaluated, measured not just for performance, but for how well she played the part. She knew the unspoken expectations. Be agreeable, never intimidating. Be impressive, but not assertive. Smile, but don't laugh too loud. She did it all. She always had. And still, something about the floor beneath her feet always felt borrowed. Her inbox, like the world around her, was full of unspoken hierarchies. One email read, "Can you make this more relatable for the team?" Followed by another, "Love the data but maybe soften the language." It wasn't feedback, it was code, and Ava knew the language well. They wanted her intelligence, just not in its natural form. They wanted her leadership, as long as it didn't sound like authority. She had learned over the years to strip her voice of too much depth, her words of too much weight, her tone of anything that could be mistaken for confrontation. Yet the restraint never protected her. The hallways of Bright Edge were pristine white walls, chrome accents and motivational plaques hanging between high-resolution art. Culture is our currency. Diversity drives innovation. But Ava could feel the contradiction in her bones. It was in the way her coworkers praised her articulate manner, as though surprised. It was in the way they touched her hair without consent, then laughed it off. It was in the way she was always asked if she was related to the new temp in accounting, just because he was also black. These weren't mistakes. They were messages. Sent, received, endured. Kara Whitmore passed her in the hallway with a smile that was both polished and poisonous. Kara was everything corporate America wanted in its leadership. Confident, sharp, white, and expertly wrapped in allyship. She used words like equity in meetings and referenced TED Talks about bias, but Ava had seen through it long ago. Behind closed doors, Kara's emails told a different story, one full of veiled warnings and preemptive undermining. Still in the office, she remained untouchable. Ava had learned never to accuse, only to observe. Accusations got you labeled difficult. Observations kept you employed. By mid-morning, Ava sat in a strategy meeting, surrounded by managers, discussing market shifts. She contributed insight that pivoted the room. The numbers spoke for themselves. Sharper returns, tighter projections, new client potential. Heads nodded. But when the senior executive summarized the ideas for the meeting minutes, Ava's name vanished. Her analysis had been rewritten into Landon Pierce's contribution. He offered no correction. No one blinked, and the meeting rolled on. This wasn't new. It was routine. At lunch, Ava ate alone. Not because she was antisocial, but because she had learned it was safer. The lunchroom was a war zone of coded alliances. One comment taken out of context, one side-eye from the wrong VP, and her name would be whispered again. Is she angry? Is she too sensitive? So she sat in silence, scrolling through a spreadsheet that didn't need to be finished until Friday. Busy always meant invisible. and invisibility for her was safer than suspicion. That afternoon, Ava was invited to a closed-door session labeled Culture Fit Assessment. No warning, no explanation, just a calendar invite, and a subject line that said everything while saying nothing. The meeting room was too bright, the air too still. She walked in, greeted by HR and two directors. Their smiles felt sharpened, polite, measured. They spoke in riddles, aligning tone, emotional safety, feedback loop. She listened carefully, understanding each phrase wasn't meant to inform but to accuse indirectly, silently, corporately. They referenced her communication style. No specific incident, just the feeling that her emails came off a bit intense. She was told the team valued her expertise, but advised to lean into humility more. No one said aggressive, no one said angry. But Ava heard it. The message was clear. She wasn't being critiqued. She was being cornered. She left the room with a nod and a thank you. Her face didn't flinch, her posture didn't sag. But inside, something tightened. Not fear, not yet. But something like gravity pulling harder than it used to. The day closed with a company-wide announcement. A new account had been won. The project was one Ava had spearheaded for 3 quarters. But her name wasn't in the memo. Landon stood in front of the floor that afternoon, giving a presentation filled with bullet points Ava had written. He glanced at her once while speaking. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't smile. By 6:30 the floor was nearly empty. Ava stayed behind, as usual tying up data reports and prepping forecasts. She looked out over the city skyline, the lights flickering across the buildings like a heartbeat. From this high, everything looked calm. But the calm wasn't peace, it was performance. Somewhere above her floor, in an office few had ever seen, Shaquille O'Neal reviewed his daily report logs. Nothing flashy, just data. Flagged communications, anonymous tips, response time analysis. He had designed a system that tracked internal injustices without relying on whispers or accusations. And Ava McCullen's name had come up 3 times this week. He leaned back in his chair, watching the lines of code scroll across the monitor. Down below, Ava shut off her screen and gathered her things. She didn't know she was being watched. Not yet. She didn't know someone had noticed the pattern, that the higher she climbed, the more the floor beneath her cracked. But the cracks had been seen, and something was coming through. The war never announced itself. No fists, no raised voices, just 1,000 tiny cuts, precise, intentional, delivered with smiling faces and sanitized language. Ava McCullen had come to know them intimately. Every day at Bright Edge Capital was a new version of the same game, where battles were fought in CC lines and tone checks, not confrontation. It started small, a missed meeting invite here, a presentation rescheduled without notice there. Minor oversights, they said. Nothing personal. But Ava had stopped believing in coincidences. The moment she realized her calendar was always the one that came last. She began noticing patterns. Documents she authored were suddenly reformatted by others before reaching the partners. Her name shrank, disappeared, then reappeared in footnotes instead of headlines. Kara Whitmore orchestrated most of it with surgical precision. To the outside world, she was a visionary VP, an advocate for equity, a mentor to rising women in finance. She quoted books about bias and hosted panels about changing the narrative. But inside the walls of Bright Edge, she moved like smoke, invisible yet consuming. Her compliments were always double-edged. You've got presence, Ava. But presence can be intimidating. Or you're strong. Maybe lead with softness next time. Kara didn't correct Ava. She carved at her until nothing sharp remained. Landon Pierce was a different kind of danger. Charming, sharp-suited, young. The kind of man who could wear rebellion like cologne, yet never lose his privilege. Landon had once asked Ava if she grew up tough, with a tone that made the question sound like a compliment. He'd built a rapport with the partners, cracking jokes over scotch and rounds of golf. Always loud, always visible. He took Ava's ideas, reshaped them in his own voice, and sold them back to the firm like they were fresh printed money. Together, Kara and Landon formed an alliance of curated appearances and strategic sabotage. Neither had to raise their voice to push Ava toward the edge. Their whispers did the work. One suggested that Ava was overwhelmed lately. Another floated the word rigid in a weekly check-in. Kara once typed the phrase lack of cultural fit in a private HR channel that Ava would never see. But Shaq's system did. The rumors began with a typo that wasn't Ava's. A number on a quarterly report had been misaligned, harmless at first, until the implication of negligence landed squarely in her lap. By the time Ava traced it back to its original editor, the error had already become a shadow in her file. No one accused her directly. They didn't need to. HR used words like monitoring and flagging for consistency, and behind every line was the same unspoken sentence: "She doesn't belong here." By week's end, Ava found herself excluded from a high-profile pitch meeting she had initiated. The client, a real estate investment group out of Chicago, had been one she cultivated from cold lead to contract ready. And yet when the final meeting alert went out, her name was missing. When she inquired, she received an apology from Kara's assistant, citing streamlined attendance, a new trend apparently. But Ava noticed Landon was still invited, along with a junior analyst who had never been part of the project. Despite everything, Ava continued to outperform expectations. Her analysis remained flawless, her leadership tight, but even excellence began to turn against her. They said she worked too independently, that she lacked collaborative energy, that her emails were too direct, too efficient, too cold. Her smile, they suggested, didn't read as warm. These weren't critiques, they were coded warnings. The air around Ava began to shift. Kaido workers who once lingered at her desk now kept their distance. Conversations paused when she walked by. She was no longer a peer. She was a risk. And in places like Bright Edge, risks didn't get promoted. They got erased. At home, Ava's son Davin asked her one night why she always looked tired. She didn't answer. Her mother, who lived with them since the stroke, noticed the bags beneath her eyes deepening. Ava pretended it was just work stress, but in truth it was the slow erosion of certainty. The realization that the ground beneath her professional life was being quietly hollowed. The final paper cut came on a Friday. Ava received a forwarded email string that hadn't been meant for her. It originated in legal, but had been passed between HR and leadership before landing. Mistakenly, in her inbox, it referenced risk management optics and internal complaint containment. Her name was listed. The date aligned with the same day she had filed a complaint about being bypassed for a leadership summit. The message concluded with a chilling phrase: "Maintain surface compliance. Terminate quietly if escalation resumes." Ava stared at the screen. Not angry, not surprised, just still. She closed the email, forwarded it to her personal account, then wiped it from her work inbox. Later that afternoon, while the office buzzed about a staff mixer hosted by Kara upstairs, Ava received a surprise calendar change. Her 4:00 status meeting was shifted to 3:30. New location, the executive boardroom. She hadn't been in that room since her onboarding. Inside, the room was cold and cavernous, filled with chrome chairs and tension. Kara sat at the head of the table, Landon to her left, HR to her right. They called it a course correction meeting. No accusations, just questions. How had she been feeling? Was she adapting? Did she feel aligned with the firm's vision? Ava answered professionally, but the questions weren't meant to be answered. They were meant to assess her compliance. The meeting ended without conclusion. No decisions. Just a reminder to reflect on feedback. As she left, Landon smiled like the outcome had already been written. Ava didn't flinch, but she knew now. The process had started. They weren't just cutting her, they were measuring her for the fall. That night, as most employees filed out for the weekend, Ava stayed back. She opened a blank document and began documenting everything. Names, dates, incidents, patterns. Not for HR, not for internal review, but for herself. Somewhere 5 floors above, Shaquille O'Neal reviewed the week's anomaly report. One employee had been flagged 3 separate times by 3 unrelated systems. Inconsistent recognition, unsanctioned project changes, and performance deviation. Despite continued success, that employee was Ava. Shaq adjusted the security feed on his monitor and paused on a still frame. Ava walking alone down the corridor, file in hand, eyes straight ahead. It was time to come down from the top. Above the 27th floor, above the floor where the real work wore blazers and smiles, and where glass doubled as armor, there existed a quieter space. Not many had been there. It wasn't listed on the office directory. The elevators didn't open to it unless you had the right code. The 33rd floor of Bright Edge Capital wasn't for show. It was where silence lived, where decisions were made long before boardrooms caught up. And in the center of that floor sat Shaquille O'Neal. Not the sports icon, not the celebrity. Here, he was something else. The majority shareholder, The quiet architect. The man who didn't just endorse the company. He owned it. His presence was rarely mentioned in BrightEdge's day-to-day operations. Most employees thought of him as ceremonial, a figurehead to bolster branding, the occasional face in an annual report. What they didn't know was that Shaq reviewed system data every morning before his coffee hit the desk. Not through meetings or memos, through signals, patterns, discrepancies. And lately, one name had surfaced too often to ignore. Ava McCullen. Her profile lit up red 3 days in a row. Not because she'd triggered violations, but because the system he'd designed years ago, a blend of behavioral metrics and internal flags, had begun alerting him to inconsistencies. Projects reassigned without traceable reason, praise from clients, not reflected in her reviews. Time spent logged into company systems without corresponding management approval. Most would miss it. But Shaq didn't build BrightEdge to miss what others ignored. He built it for what they buried. He sat at the edge of a long desk, a single screen casting light across the dark room. His fingers moved slowly across the touchpad, flipping through layers of data, call logs, badge scans, internal chat threads. He wasn't looking for scandal. He was looking for pattern, and what he saw was unmistakable. Ava McCullen was being watched. Yes, but not by him. By those trying to erase her. The building itself carried secrets in the spaces no one respected. Janitors pushing carts of silence past closed doors, temps passed over like fixtures, interns told to observe quietly. But they noticed things. Always had. The janitor on the 27th floor, a woman named Francine, saw the boxes at Ava's desk multiply while others downsized. She knew when someone was being edged out. She'd seen it too many times. Francine never said a word, but once a week she slipped a note into the cleaning report meant for upper operations. A code, 3 checkmarks, one for rumor, one for retaliation, one for silence. Shaq had trained for signals like that. A mailroom temp named Darnell had noticed it too. He was 19, eyes sharp, ears sharper. Watched Ava walk out of meeting rooms differently. Slower, tighter. One day, he saw Kara and Landon laughing in the break room after Ava passed. Kara held a folder that Ava had carried earlier that morning. Darnell didn't trust smiles like that. He noted the time, tucked it into a message log on a hidden submission site BrightEdge kept for anonymous staff alerts. Most didn't know about it. Darnell found it during orientation and bookmarked it, just in case. Another ping for Ava. The intern was the most nervous of them all. Name was Jessa, fresh out of college, terrified of doing anything wrong. But she saw the change. Ava had once been her mentor during onboarding. Patient, kind, efficient. Now, no one sat with Ava at lunch. Kara had warned her gently. Give her space. She's under a lot. But Jessa noticed how often Ava's emails went unread in threads. How the meeting minutes rarely reflected her contributions. She hesitated for days before finally submitting her notes to the internal ethics review portal. It landed in the system. Shaq read it line by line. These weren't dramatic declarations. No one had shouted or threatened. This wasn't a public takedown. It was precise, strategic, quiet. The kind of erasure that left no fingerprints but killed careers slowly. And Ava had become a target. Not because she'd done something wrong, but because she was too good to ignore and too proud to bend. Shaq leaned back, eyes narrowing. In his mind he heard his mother's voice again. Lucille, the woman who taught him to notice the quiet things. To see the spaces in between what people said. She used to tell him, power doesn't just show up in who talks loudest. It shows up in who controls who gets heard. And that's what this was. Not just suppression. Control. He opened another window, pulled up access logs. He filtered Kara's approvals, Landon's document changes, and meeting records over the last 60 days. Dozens of Ava's files had been reassigned within hours of submission. Not denied. Just shifted. Made to look incomplete. Ava had likely never seen it happening. That was the trick. They didn't attack her. They unthreaded her. And for the first time in weeks, Shaq stood up. He wasn't a man who micromanaged. He believed in letting leaders lead. But this wasn't leadership. This was sabotage. In a suit, he stared down at the building's lower levels, through the tinted glass that made his office near invisible from the outside. He didn't see numbers anymore. He saw movement, fear, strategy. He saw someone trying to quietly erase a woman who had worked too hard to be taken lightly. It was time to shift the lens. Shaq typed a command, triggering a deeper audit of Ava's file. He pushed a secondary order to the building's internal compliance team. Silent, restricted access only. Then he pulled up one final screen, the floor plan of level. He zoomed in on the conference rooms. Room 5B had been booked under Kara's name 3 times that week from meetings not listed in the public schedule. He clicked open the access logs. Ava had entered all 3, each one followed by a system change to her project permission. Shaq didn't speak aloud, didn't curse, just exhaled slow. The shadows had spoken. It was time to move. On a gray Wednesday morning, the tone inside Bright Edge Capital shifted like a storm no one wanted to name. The light outside had dimmed beneath thick clouds, though the 27th floor still glowed with its usual sterilized calm. The cold elegance of productivity and power. Ava McCullen stepped into the building just as she had for 3 years. Early, efficient, unreadable. But this morning something in the air was different. The greetings were fewer, the glances tighter, and when she reached her desk, the calendar notification was already waiting for her like a sentence she hadn't heard read yet. Subject: Culture Alignment Session. Location: Meeting Room 5B. It was short, without context, but it rang loud in Ava's memory. Room 5B. The same room where last quarter's client pitch had been rerouted out from under her. The same room where she'd last presented her quarterly impact report, which disappeared from the archives a week later. Her stomach tightened, not from fear but from familiarity. She knew the play. She just didn't know which chapter they were on. The hours crawled. At 10:58, Ava stood, adjusted her jacket, and walked down the glass corridor past coworkers who barely looked up. She didn't knock. She didn't need to. The door opened as she reached it, as if the room had been waiting. Inside sat Kara Whitmore at the head of the conference table, her blonde hair wrapped in a tidy twist, her mouth already shaping something sympathetic. To her left was Camille from HR, face blank and clipboard tight in her lap. And beside her, silently thumbing a pen, was Landon Pierce, the same junior partner who'd once laughed with Ava over bad catering and late nights, now sitting like a judge behind glass. "Ava," Kara said, voice coated in concern, "thank you for coming." They didn't invite her to sit. She did anyway, and waited. Kara began the conversation with a polished tone, filled with practiced pauses and empathy-laced phrasing. Camille followed with bullet points on team cohesion, feedback from peers, and emerging concerns around Ava's alignment with Bright Edge's core culture values. Not one specific accusation, just brushstrokes enough to paint a problem without pointing a finger. Ava listened. Her face was unreadable, but inside she counted each word as a weapon. Words like disconnected, tone, aggressive, and unintentional disruption, all of them dressed in politeness, yet sharpened like knives. Landon leaned back and nodded occasionally, letting the women do the carving. Then came the folder. Kara slid it across the table with delicate fingers, as if she were offering help instead of delivering humiliation. Inside was a 2-page statement titled, "Apology Regarding Team Culture Breach." The language was smooth, an acknowledgement of misalignment, a pledge to refocus on shared values, and a commitment to softer interpersonal dynamics. At the bottom, in faint blue ink, was Ava's name, signed, dated. But Ava hadn't seen this document before, hadn't typed a single word. Her eyes stayed on the signature. Camille began talking again, explaining how this was a gesture of trust, an opportunity to move forward positively, with the understanding that Ava would attend a behavioral coaching program, hosted by Kara's own firm-affiliated consultant. Ava's ears rang with the sound of thinly veiled coercion. She looked up slowly, her silence building like pressure behind glass. It wasn't the lie that stunned her. It was the ease of it, how routine it all felt, how comfortable they were in scripting her confession, without her consent. There was no mistake here. This was design. Kara smiled faintly, as though already imagining the file closed and buried. But Ava didn't touch the folder. She stood. Not abruptly, not emotionally, just precisely. Her voice didn't come. It didn't need to. Silence had become her sharpest language. She looked at Camille first, long enough for discomfort to surface. Then at Landon, who straightened in his chair, suddenly remembering the cameras in the room. Finally, her eyes settled on Kara, a stare that didn't accuse, didn't plead, didn't flinch. Then she turned and left the room. No one followed. Outside the door, the hallway felt colder, empty. Ava walked slowly back to her office, aware now that the war wasn't coming. It had already started. and it was being waged in forms she couldn't fight head-on. But something inside her had begun to shift. Not fear, not confusion, something more precise. Like steel forming under fire. When she reached her desk, she opened her drawer and pulled out a black notebook. She hadn't used it in years. But today she flipped to a blank page and began writing. Not thoughts, not feelings, facts, dates, meetings, room numbers, changes to her permissions, copies of flagged emails, screenshots. Every incident etched in careful, clinical strokes. This wasn't just for memory, it was for proof. She saved everything to a secure drive, disconnected from the company server. The remainder of the day passed without confrontation. Landon passed her once in the corridor, but didn't speak. Camille walked by her office with a glance too quick to meet. Camille walked by her office with a glance too quick to meet. Kara didn't show herself again. The act was over. The audience dismissed. But Ava knew something they didn't. Their silence wasn't closure. It was cover. At 5:13 p.m., as the office emptied out for the evening, Ava remained at her desk, clicking through archived versions of shared folders. A few files had been rolled back, interestingly just hours before her culture alignment session. She traced user edits and recognized Landon's ID tag on 2 of them. She took screenshots. Then, just as she shut her laptop, a maintenance cart rolled by. Francine, the janitor, nodded gently as she passed, then paused. Without saying a word, she placed a folded sticky note beside Ava's desk lamp. No words, just 3 red check marks drawn in thick marker. Ava nodded once. Upstairs, on the 33rd floor, Shaq was already reviewing the timestamp on the forged document. His security algorithm had flagged the signature as a mismatch. The original file had been created on Kara's credentials, edited 3 times by Camille, then forwarded from Landon's IP address. The camera in room 5B showed the meeting in full. Shaq watched it twice. He didn't need more confirmation. He needed timing. Because Ava hadn't broken in that meeting. She'd awakened, and the moment was coming, when silence would no longer be enough. The day after the culture alignment meeting, she began to track backwards. She wasn't looking for mistakes. She was looking for erasure, the kind that doesn't make noise when it happens, only when it's exposed. Ava had always kept meticulous notes, but now she began reconstructing a broader picture, not through her own emails, but through edits, permissions, folder access. She'd once been praised for her digital hygiene. Now that trait would become her armor. She logged into the BrightEdge versioning system, one of the few tools untouched by the HR rebranding process. From there she tracked changes to her quarterly projections file, the same file that had gone mysteriously missing just before last month's partner review. The system showed that it had been accessed 4 times between 2:00 and 4:00 a.m. on a Saturday. Ava never worked weekends. She didn't have to guess who did. The name on the access log read, L. Pierce, internal. Another file, her internal presentation to the ethics board, showed 2 completely overwritten versions submitted under her ID, but the keystroke history revealed a different login origin, CWXX Office, Kara Whitmore's initials. Her account, masking as Ava's. The switch had happened during a security reset window, a 15-minute gap used for back-end updates. It was only traceable because Ava knew where to look. She took screenshots, each one timestamped, saved to her encrypted cloud storage. Then she moved to the meeting archives. BrightEdge automatically records every session held in high-level conference rooms, but access requires elevated clearance. Ava didn't have it, not anymore. But she remembered something from her onboarding. The video logs were backed up separately to an older drive system, one that still fed to the media server for internal training compilations. Most people had forgotten about it. She hadn't. It took her nearly an hour, but she found the secondary stream from room 5B, buried beneath onboarding videos and outdated compliance modules. There was no sound, just video footage. But the images were clear enough. Ava watched herself sit across from Kara, Camille, and Landon. She watched Kara slide the folder across the table, watched the camera catch the exact moment. Ava looked down and realized her name had been forged. She clipped the footage and uploaded it. It wasn't enough yet, but it was beginning to take shape. That night, long after the office emptied, and the motion-activated lights flicked off row by row, Ava sat back in her chair and stared at the last set of folders she hadn't opened, archived HR compliance threads. Her access to them had technically been revoked, but a security loophole from an old role gave her passive viewing rights to versions exported before the system upgrade. She typed her name into the archive query bar. Only one thread returned a match. The subject line sent a chill through her. Liability threshold Ava McCullen. The sender was anonymous, a rotating security alias used only by internal compliance. The recipients were Kara, Camille, and two names she didn't recognize. The message was short, blunt, not dressed in HR niceties. Concerns escalating. Visibility is increasing. If external exposure occurs, remove position quietly and reframe via performance track. If no exposure, continue containment strategy. The phrase reframe via performance track repeated again, further down. Ava didn't need interpretation. It meant bury her in process. Blame soft metrics, and exit her without the stain of lawsuit. Clean. Corporate. Contain. She read the message twice. And again, her hands didn't shake. She just felt colder. Scrolling through the rest of the chain, she stopped on one line, a forwarded memo reference mentioning an Elijah Boone. The name was faintly familiar, like an echo from early training sessions. She ran a search on the company intranet. Nothing came up. No employee record, no former leadership credits, no board memos. But in one archived training manual PDF from her onboarding year, she found his name mentioned under Chief Operating Oversight in a compliance section. Vanished. Scrubbed. She checked public LinkedIn records. Still nothing. But when she searched externally, on an obscure financial watchdog site, a single record appeared. Elijah Boone, former BrightEdge COO, listed as terminated without announcement after a whistleblower complaint led to a quiet payout. No lawsuit filed, no press coverage, but a number, $3.2 million. Settled, sealed, buried. Another name, erased. Another pattern confirmed. Ava leaned back, the walls around her no longer sterile but complicit. She knew now that she wasn't just a target of circumstance. She had been a strategy, a variable in a risk model. A box checked for optics, then boxed out when her light burned too bright. She hadn't been promoted because she wasn't meant to ascend. She was never designed to stay. Only displayed. Upstairs on the 33rd floor, Shaq reviewed a system sync alert, an anomaly. Archives threads accessed from a revoked credential. It didn't concern him. He already knew who it was. Eva had crossed the point of passive resistance. She was now in motion. Shaq stood from his desk and turned toward the city skyline. In one hand, he held a thin folder. Elijah Boone's file, unredacted, the original. Ava had found the trail. It was time he widened it. 6. Shaq enters the floor. The lobby of BrightEdge Capital had never seen a man like him arrive unnoticed. Not because of his height or presence, both of which could silence rooms, but because this morning, Shaquille O'Neal came through without entourage, without press, without announcement, no assistant, no warning, just a gray hoodie, pressed dark jeans, and sneakers that made less noise than his name usually did. He bypassed security with a flick of his keycard, a platinum-coated access badge few even knew existed. The guard nodded, recognizing him too late to say anything. Shaq didn't pause. He took the executive elevator without a word, and pressed the button to the 27th. When the doors slid open, the energy didn't shift right away. People barely looked up. The floor buzzed with the polite rhythm of corporate ritual, mouse clicks, coffee machines, laughter just loud enough to suggest ease. No one expected power to arrive wearing cotton and silence, and Shaq preferred it that way. He didn't head for the boardroom. He walked the halls, quietly, slowly. He passed by glass-walled offices, where smiles hid strategies, and where voices lowered. As he approached, the nameplate outside Kara Whitmore's office was polished, as always, sitting above a motivational quote, framed in rose gold. The door was cracked open. Inside she sat with Camille, their conversation halting the moment his shadow stretched across the frame. He didn't stop. He kept walking. The farther he went, the more the surface cracked. A group of analysts huddled in a conference room, whispering behind spreadsheets they weren't really reading. A pair of interns froze when they saw him pass. One even nudged the other, eyes wide, not sure if they should greet him or pretend not to see. Shaq made no move. He wasn't here to be seen. He was here to see. He rounded the corner and found her. Ava sitting at her desk, shoulders square, eyes fixed on her screen, the only person on the floor who didn't seem thrown by his presence. She hadn't looked up yet, but Shaq knew what he was seeing. a woman holding her spine upright through gravity. Others had designed. He stood for a moment, just outside her line of vision, watching. Not out of surveillance, out of memory. He thought of Lucille. He remembered the bank on 8th and Jefferson, back when he was too young to understand what had happened. His mother had dressed sharp that day, navy blue blazer, patent leather shoes, her resume folded in thirds inside a folder she held like a shield. She never got past the reception desk. The manager hadn't even shaken her hand. When they left, Shaq asked why her voice had sounded different in there. She told him, "Sometimes you have to shrink just to survive the room." He never forgot the look on her face as they walked back to the bus stop. That kind of silence didn't fade. It settled into the bones. And now, years later, he saw the same silence in Ava. Not broken, but contained, waiting. From a few steps away, he saw her screen flicker as she closed a confidential file, her hand moving with precise intent. She was cataloging, gathering, defending without permission, a war waged in PDFs and protocols. She didn't need help, but she needed backup. Shaq stepped back into the hallway, now aware of how quiet the floor had become. Kara had emerged from her office, holding her composure like a vase balanced on glass. She smiled. "Shaquille," she said, voice bright. "We weren't expecting." He raised a hand, calm, not rude, but final. "I'm not here for meetings," she faltered mid-step. "Of course. Can we get you?" "No." Then he turned and walked toward Landon's office. Landon was laughing on a call when Shaq stepped in without knocking. The laugh died mid-sentence. The phone lowered slowly. "Sir." Shaq scanned the room without interest. The plaques, the certificates, the carefully staged photos of charity events. "You're Landon Pierce," he said flatly. "Not a question." Landon nodded, swallowing air. Shaq nodded once, then walked out. That was all he needed. By the time he returned to the elevator, the atmosphere had collapsed into whispers. Eyes followed him now. Postures shifted. Kara was already making calls. HR was already speculating. But Shaq wasn't interested in damage control. He was mapping the battlefield. As he rode up to the 33rd floor, he reviewed the morning-like footage. Every eye that darted, every pause that lingered. He noted who greeted him, and who didn't, who stood and who shrank. None of it was coincidence. In his private office, he sat down at the edge of his desk and opened a live feed of floor activity. Not surveillance, accountability. His compliance algorithm had already logged 5 suspicious actions triggered during his walkthrough. Camille had attempted to delete a folder. Kara had accessed the company media server. Landon had requested an urgent audit of Ava's project logs. The scramble had begun. Shaq leaned forward, placed his elbows on his knees, and stared at the screen. This wasn't about one woman anymore. It was about what the company had become when no one was looking. Back in Ava's office, she finally looked up from her monitor. Her screen showed a file list with new labels. Audit evidence 1 through 14. She clicked upload all. Her eyes met the camera in the corner. Not a flinch. Not a smile. Just focus. Shaq watched her click send, and he nodded. No words, no announcement. But war had been declared. Not through confrontation, through exposure. Friday began with sunlight streaking across the marble floors of Bright Edge Capital like a false promise. The sky outside was clear, the kind of blue that usually felt like clarity. But inside, the air carried a tension that Ava McCullen couldn't yet name, a vibration in her bones that told her the trap was finally about to spring. She had been scheduled to lead the quarterly client review for a major account, the same one she'd nurtured from onboarding to expansion. It was her presentation, her data, her design. Every projection had been double-checked, every graph fine-tuned. She arrived early, checked the projector cables herself, and rehearsed the opening in her head as she waited in conference room 3. The clients arrived first. 4 sharply dressed executives from Stratwood Partners, 2 of whom greeted Ava by name, with genuine warmth. She had built this relationship over 18 months. They trusted her voice, her vision. She stood beside the screen, hands clasped calmly, waiting for the last person to enter. Then the door opened, and Kara Whitmore stepped in, followed closely by Landon Pierce. They didn't acknowledge her. They simply took seats at the far end of the table. Kara offered the clients a polished smile. "We're thrilled you're here. We're proud of the team's progress." Ava nodded at her cue. She moved to the center of the room, remote in hand, and tapped the first slide. The screen blinked once, then black. She tried again. Nothing. She glanced at the laptop, the file still open on her desktop. But the screen froze, flickered, and displayed a message Ava hadn't seen before. Access denied. Credentials invalid. Ava stood still for a beat, heart thudding. She logged out, re-entered her details. Denied again. Landon leaned forward, feigning concern. Trouble with access? His voice was soft, just loud enough for the clients to hear. Eva turned to him slowly. This file was working 15 minutes ago. I'm sure it can help, Kara offered, already standing. Landon, why don't you walk through the high-level summary in the meantime? Before Ava could speak, Kara took her gently by the elbow, a motion that seemed polite to onlookers, but was firm enough to move her out of the spotlight. The next 5 minutes passed in a blur. Landon clicked to a mirrored presentation, not as detailed, not as clean, but familiar. It was Ava's file, stripped down and rebranded with his watermark. He had her work, and her access had been shut down. From the hallway, Ava stood in silence, arms crossed, eyes hard on the floor. A tech assistant arrived a few minutes later, already briefed. We're running diagnostics on your profile. May take a few hours, maybe an internal permissions reset. Ava didn't reply. She walked back to her office, boots silent across the polished floor. She didn't touch her laptop, didn't check emails. She knew what came next. By noon, the summons arrived. Room 14C. Effective immediately, Camille was already waiting, flanked by Kara and a legal liaison Ava hadn't met before. No time for pleasantries, no room for protest. Camille started reading from a typed statement. After a pattern of inconsistent team engagement, technical instability, and feedback regarding cultural friction, Ava tuned it out. Not because she didn't care, but because it had all been said before. Just not out loud. Today, it was official. Today, they no longer needed whispers. They handed her a performance improvement plan, a list of abstract goals, vague behaviors to course correct, milestones impossible to measure. She had seen these used before, not as tools for improvement, but as blueprints for removal. Eva took the paper, folded it once, and placed it in her bag. Camille offered her the courtesy of collecting her things personally. We'd like this to be discreet. Eva smiled at that. Discreet. They wanted silence. They'd made a stage out of her collapse, and now they wanted quiet as she disappeared. She walked back to her desk. No one made eye contact. Some had already heard. Others didn't need to. The energy had shifted. She took her time packing, the framed photo of Devon from last year's science fair, the leather notebook she never left unlocked, the paperweight shaped like a compass, a gift from her mother on her first day. Her hands moved with calm precision. But inside, the silence was no longer passive. It was molten. When her box was full, she stood, adjusted her coat, and turned toward the elevators. At the front desk, a young black receptionist, named Marla, watched her approach with wide, careful eyes. She couldn't have been older than 23, still learning how to navigate the maze that Ava had just walked through. Ava met her gaze, didn't speak. But as she reached for the call button, Marla stepped forward and placed something into her palm. A folded piece of paper, warm from her hand. Ava nodded once, stepped into the elevator, and let the doors close behind her. As the numbers lit one by one, she unfolded the paper. Just 2 words, written in blue ink. He knows. Monday arrived like thunder before a storm. No rain yet. But the air electric. Expectant. Just after 8 a.m., a security memo flashed across every screen in the Bright Edge Capitol building. It was brief. No pleasantries. No time. All personnel from floors 24-29 are required to report to conference room 9B. Attendance is mandatory. Leave all devices at your desk. Silence followed. Then movement. The elevator banks clogged with tension. Phones buzzed with unanswered questions. Rumors took the stairs 2 at a time. Kara Whitmore, dressed sharper than usual in a deep navy suit, looked unnerved but composed. Landon Pierce arrived 10 minutes early, chewing gum to mask the dryness in his mouth. Camille from HR clutched a folder so tightly her knuckles paled. By 8:45, the room was full. Conference room 9B wasn't used often. It was reserved for high-tier compliance reviews and occasional fire drills. Today, no one joked. No one asked questions. Everyone sat.
Then the doors locked.
An audible click rolled through the tension, like a trigger pulled. The screen at the front came alive. A dark background, with white text. Data Audit Report 33F Unauthorized Suppression and Manipulation of Employee Records. No one moved. And then the elevator chimed. Out stepped Shaquille O'Neal. No announcement. No security detail. Just him. A quiet force in black. A tailored hoodie. Gray slacks. Sneakers. That didn't squeak. He didn't look angry. He looked ready. Shaq walked to the front of the room, standing just left of the screen. He didn't sit. He didn't greet. He didn't clear his throat. He just pressed the remote. The first slide opened. A time-stamped log of Ava McCullen's files, showing unauthorized edits from Landon's account. The room stiffened. Next slide. An email chain with the subject line Liability Threshold. Ava McCullen. All names visible. Kara. Camille. 2 executives. Date stamped. Trace. Then came the video. Security footage from room 5. No audio. Just visuals. Ava receiving a folder. Her eyes locking on the forged signature. Her silent stare. Her exit. A perfectly cut moment. Slide after slide followed. Performance reviews altered. Survey data deleted. Access logs rerouted. 3 different anonymous tips. An HR complaint scrubbed from the system. And then, voice recordings. Not wiretaps, meeting recap memos captured by assistants, unaware of what they were preserving. Kara's voice. We just need her contained long enough to make it clean. Camille's voice. She's not responding to cues. We may need a correction plan. Shaq stood in stillness. He wasn't loud. He didn't shout. He just began reading names. Camille Fields terminated immediately. Your digital access has already been revoked. A formal legal review begins this afternoon. Camille dropped her folder. Landon Pierce, your credentials were used to overwrite financial data on 5 occasions. You are no longer with this company. Landon rose halfway, his voice barely forming a protest before a second slide showed a video clip of him accessing Ava's profile during the weekend. The screen shifted again. Thomas Rayner, removed for breach of ethical oversight. Kara Whitmore, her name landed like an executioner's knock. Kara didn't breathe. Shaq turned to her. You personally coordinated a falsified PP. You orchestrated internal sabotage under the guise of mentorship. You manipulated compliance records. And you targeted a high-performing black employee with a campaign of calculated exclusion. The room watched as Kara's face collapsed in slow-motion disbelief. I have no further use for you in this company, Shaq said. Kara stood on shaky feet. Her mouth opened, not for defense but denial. It never reached her lips, because just then the screen blinked one final time. A live feed from the lobby security desk showed Ava walking through the front doors, head high, coat flowing behind her like armor. Kara's knees buckled. She didn't fall entirely. But someone rushed to her side. No one looked twice. Shaq nodded toward the exit. A security team stood waiting. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. One by one, the named were escorted out. Shaq remained. The rest of the staff stayed seated. Some watched the door. Others stared at their hands. A few silently wept, not for those removed, but because something buried had just been named out loud. Shaq let the silence breathe before speaking again. This company exists because people believe in something greater than profit. Because people come here hoping they'll be seen for their work. That they'll be judged by their results, not their race. That they can succeed without having to shrink. He looked around the room. I failed Ava by not stepping in sooner. That's on me.
No one moved.
But what happens now? That's on all of us. Then he turned to the screen, one last time. A new slide. Reinstatement order. Ava McCullen, Director of Ethics and Accountability. Effective immediately. Shaq walked out without applause.
There was none needed.
Only acknowledgement. Only change. When Ava McCullen stepped back into Bright Edge Capital, it was not through the side door. It wasn't quiet, and it wasn't rushed. She arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the lockdown, dressed in slate gray, heels clicking with the confidence of someone who no longer had to apologize for her space. There was no applause, only stillness and attention. The same people who had once looked past her now looked up. Not out of fear, not in forced courtesy, but in reckoning. Not because she demanded it, because something unspoken had shifted. The badge she wore now bore a new title. Director of Corporate Ethics and Accountability. A new department. A new seat, reporting directly to the top. To Shaquille O'Neal himself. She didn't return to her old office. That space had already been reassigned. She didn't want it anyway. The walls held memories of silence, of endurance. Her new space sat 2 floors above, between compliance and legal. Transparent doors, minimal decor, one large quote framed behind her desk, not printed but handwritten in black marker. The room only changes if the ones who've been kept out take the seat. It wasn't signed. She didn't need it to be. Shaq visited her office on day 1, not to brief her, but to listen. No speeches, no ceremony, just clarity between equals. He outlined the department's reach: internal oversight, anonymous reporting, mandatory leadership audits, every quarter, and full authority to restructure whatever she found broken. Her first move wasn't loud. She implemented a reporting system built on blind verification, where no complaint could be flagged or rerouted without passing through a triplicate audit. It neutralized bias before it could plant roots. Within 10 days, 6 suppressed complaints resurfaced. 2 resulted in rapid policy revisions. Then came the memos. Short, sharp, written by Ava herself. Culture is not a campaign. It's the consequence of what you protect. They weren't slogans. They were reminders. Kara's empty office became a neutral training suite, a place where future managers now learned what harm looks like when it hides behind strategy. Landon's old nameplate was melted down and recast into a plaque outside the break room that read, "There is no performance without integrity." The whispers still existed, but their texture had changed, no longer cowardly or cynical. People talked, but now they did so with accountability in their voices. Questions replaced assumptions. Some staff left quietly, others stayed and shifted. The interns walked straighter, the temps smiled longer, and Ava walked the halls. She greeted everyone, not to make a statement, but because she always had. Only now, no one questioned her tone, her expression, her presence. The same face that had once been labeled too unreadable was now regarded as resolute. She passed the receptionist's desk on her 4th day and saw Marla, the same young woman who'd slipped her that folded note. Ava stopped, eyes catching hers. No words exchanged, just a look and a nod. Upstairs, Shaq reviewed the first ethics summary report. Eva submitted. It was structured, unembellished, and impossible to misinterpret. In the final paragraph, she'd written a single line outside the template. Power doesn't need to raise its voice to correct a lie. Shaq closed the file, leaned back in his chair, and smiled faintly. He thought of Lucille again, not the version the world saw on stage or in interviews, but the woman who had scrubbed floors while dreaming of tables. Her name was never allowed on. She would have liked Ava, would have understood her pace, her pause, her power. The rebuilding continued, slowly, intentionally. HR was retrained under new leadership. Not just on bias, but on systems. How silence is written into policies. How erasure is built through structure. Ava led the sessions herself, starting each with one question: what does accountability feel like when no one is watching? There were no volunteers at first. By the 3rd week, hands rose. It wasn't performative. It was shift. In one corner office, an executive now kept Ava's audit log open beside his dashboard. In another, a team created a rotating voice circle, where the floor belonged to whoever had spoken least that week. These were not rules. They were responses. Ava didn't seek recognition. But change has a rhythm, and her name pulsed through the building differently now. Her inbox filled with quiet thank yous, late apologies, and confessions she never asked for. She read them all, responded to none. That wasn't her job. Justice wasn't retrospective. It was what you built next. Eva moved with precision, her pace calm but unstoppable. And though some still watched her with remnants of old discomfort, none of them looked away. One morning, as she reviewed a new whistleblower portal, she paused at a draft submission. It had no name, just a note. "I'm still scared, but you proved it's worth speaking." She didn't smile. She saved it, and moved on. The silence that once suffocated now worked in her favor. It wasn't empty anymore. It was listening. As she walked down the corridor that afternoon, someone whispered her name. Not in malice, but in reverence. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. Her power no longer came from being heard. It came from not needing permission to speak. And if anyone asked her, if anyone dared to wonder how she had returned so strong, so still, they'd never hear bitterness. Only this: "I didn't rise. They fell." A year had passed, But the world had not softened. It had shifted, slowly, precisely, like tectonic plates adjusting under decades of weight. Some structures cracked, others held, and some, like Bright Edge Capital, began to change not because of a press release or a scandal, but because one woman refused to disappear quietly. The campus at Spelman College shimmered beneath a warm spring sun. Students moved in clusters of energy, bright-eyed, driven, unapologetically present. The auditorium was nearly full by the time Ava McCullen walked onto the stage. No grand entrance, no fanfare. Just her poised, centered, carrying the silence she had turned into power. She wore navy today, a nod to Lucille O'Neill, though no one else knew. Her hair pinned high, her eyes steady, her notes tucked into a leather-bound folder she didn't open. The crowd hushed as she stepped to the microphone. No music, no video montage. Just her story, her voice. She began slowly, choosing each word as if placing bricks for others to step on. She didn't mention names. She didn't need to. She spoke of patterns, of rooms that smiled while sharpening knives. She spoke of invisibility wrapped in professionalism, of excellence used as evidence against you, of erasure that comes wearing pearl earrings and quarterly bonuses. She told them about how the most dangerous violence isn't loud. It's quiet, procedural, wrapped in policies designed to look neutral but loaded with consequence. She described the day she lost access to her own work, the meeting with the forged signature, the folder she never signed. She didn't cry. She didn't pause for effect. But her voice held gravity. Every student leaned forward, as if they could feel the weight of the floor she once stood on, and how it had tried to vanish beneath her. She told them about reclamation, about not burning the system down, but rebuilding the foundation so others wouldn't fall through it. She spoke of new policies, audit trails, internal shifts, not victories, evolution. And when she finished, the room was silent for a long breath. Then came the standing ovation. In the back row, behind the final column near the aisle, Shaquille O'Neal remained seated. His hands folded, his chest still, his eyes locked on the stage. He didn't need to stand. He didn't need to be seen. He had always understood something others missed. That real legacy doesn't come with applause. It comes with protection. After the event, Ava stayed behind. She met with a circle of students, future leaders, future whistleblowers, future voices, no longer waiting to be given space. She spoke plainly with them, asked what they wanted to build, not what they wanted to survive. Shaq waited outside, watching from a distance as he always had. He hadn't said much to her that year. They'd exchanged notes, approvals, progress reports. But they didn't speak often. Not because there was distance, but because they understood each other too well to need words. Eventually she emerged. They stood near the courtyard, beneath a wide oak tree, its branches sprawling like witness. "You came," she said. Shaq nodded. "Always was." She smiled at that. They didn't speak of the past. Not of Landon. Not Kara. Not the boardroom that almost broke her. They spoke of the interns. The new hires. The quiet change now moving through the building like oxygen. She told him 3 more companies had asked her to consult. She hadn't answered yet. Not because she was hesitant, but because she was making them wait. Letting them learn patience. He chuckled. "You're good at that," he said. She nodded. Learned it in the silence. They stood there for a few more minutes, 2 people who knew the cost of power, and what it meant to carry it without corruption. When they parted ways, it wasn't ceremonial. It was necessary. The kind of farewell that meant the mission had shifted, not ended. The next morning at Bright Edge, the elevators opened with their usual hum. The building looked the same. Polished floors, high windows, strategically staged furniture. But the energy had changed. From the lobby, 3 new hires stepped inside. All black women, all wearing the armor of achievement and the softness of laughter. They didn't whisper. They didn't shrink. They stood tall. One of them held a training folder with Ava's name on the cover. As the elevator climbed, their conversation didn't dim. They spoke of systems, of strategy, of purpose. They joked about how quiet the floor was going to be once they arrived. They didn't know that same elevator once carried Ava down with a box in her arms and a warning in her hand. They only knew it carried them up now. In Ava's office, a vase of fresh lilies stood by the window. Her chair turned toward the skyline, her desk neat. A quote hung above her monitor, framed now in matte black. "Some men build empires. Some protect what empires forget. The empire was watching. But this time, it remembered. And this time it listened. If you've ever been told to tone it down, this story was for you. If you've ever watched silence win, then felt the shift when truth finally spoke, you're not alone. This isn't just fiction. It's a mirror, a movement, a warning shot. Stay close. The next story doesn't start without you.